Yep, I'm on here. There we go. Excellent. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Ryan Jones. I'm a program manager on the Azure Resource Manager team. And so today we'll be talking about ARM. I know that how many of you guys were able to attend Mark's session yesterday? Okay, so you got a bit of a primer on ARM yesterday. What about Corey's session? Anybody attend Corey's session? Okay, so today we'll be going a little bit more deeply into the features and capabilities of Azure Resource Manager itself and how it works across a broad set of services, rather than focusing on the specifics of what you can do with compute and networking and storage, even though we will demonstrate that as well. So let's get started. Here's the obligatory slide where I ask you to tell my boss how well or how poorly I talked about ARM today. So please tell him I was awesome, okay? It'll make it a lot easier on me when I go home. So one of the questions I'm often asked is, in a sentence or two, what would you say Azure Resource Manager is? And I would say, well, Azure Resource Manager is our consistent management layer, or API, for the cloud. So this is our next-gen API surface area for managing resources in Azure. It provides a single API endpoint for different clients, such as the Azure portal, or such as Azure CLI, or such as PowerShell or Visual Studio, to communicate with all the different services that exist in Windows Azure. Authentication is provided via OpenID Connect as well as OAuth. These can be provided by ADFS or Azure Active Directory. And one of the things that's actually unique about Resource Manager is it's a technology that we are not only building and developing for our public cloud, but it's also a technology that we're building for our private cloud as well. The intent being that applications that you build for Azure can also be deployable to partner or private enterprise data centers over time. Now, Resource Manager communicates via a very specific contract called the Resource Provider Contract. And then we have a broad set of resource providers. Many of these resource providers are the services that you know and use today. Things like websites, SQL database, virtual machines now, virtual networks now, storage accounts, and the list goes on and on and on. So that's my elevator pitch for ARM. We're going to have three areas of focus in today's discussion, and these are really aligned to our major areas of investment in Resource Manager. Number one is we're going to talk about how you can use Resource Manager to deploy your applications to the cloud. Number two is we're going to talk about how, as we see people are using the cloud more and more, they're deploying more complex applications. We're looking to see how ARM can help you organize the resources that support your various apps. And then finally, we'll show how Resource Manager allows you to maintain control of all of those building blocks and Legos that you use to support your mission-critical applications. Cool? So, with no further hesitation, let's dig into deploying with Azure Resource Manager. First, deployment is primarily template-driven. Okay, we're looking to provide you with a way that you can declaratively and in an idempotent manner or repeatable manner deploy your applications to the cloud once again, many times. A couple reasons why you might do this. You might be an ISV. You also might want to use this for dev or test scenarios where you can deploy an application once and then re-execute that template to ensure that the state of the application matches your intent. The other thing about Azure Resource Manager templates is they're natively multi-service. So historically, if you've used Azure Service Management API, you know that you could represent compute and networking and storage inside of CSPKG, right? But you could not include websites, as an example. Well, with Resource Manager, every service that is onboarding to us, we're able to template against that service. And so therefore, what you'll find in the very near future is all the services in Azure will be templatable or deployable from ARM. The other thing is Resource Manager templates are innately multi-region as well. And so it allows you to very quickly and easily deploy applications that span our data centers around the world. One of the things that we think that makes Azure very unique is that we do have 19 data center locations, and we want you to be able to deploy single global applications which leverage all 19 of those regions. And then finally, our deployments with Resource Manager are extensible. We do this through two mechanisms. One is we allow third parties to build resource providers which plug into Resource Manager. How many of you guys have heard of SendGrid? Okay, they plug into Resource Manager as well, so you can build your messaging services with SendGrid as a part of your application templates. What about New Relic? Same thing there. Both of those third parties are onboarded into Resource Manager so that you can provision and manage those services alongside the rest of the applications that they work with. So before we go any further, there's an important concept that we need to make sure that we all understand together, and this is the resource group. Resource group is like a folder on your file system. It's a container for multiple resources, okay? Now these resources must exist in one and only one resource group. Resource groups can span regions, so I can have one resource group that contains, for example, a virtual machine in West US and a virtual machine in West Europe. Okay, and additionally, resource groups, as I mentioned earlier, can span services. So I can have a website, a database, a virtual machine, a cache, all inside of the same resource group. Okay, so with that in mind, hey, it's great that we have this nice new organizational construct, but how do I actually populate this resource with the things that I care about? And we have two ways that we can do this. The first is through imperative mechanisms. This is what you're used to doing in many cases today for virtual machines, which is where you'll use PowerShell or you use the portal to say, hey, new Azure VM, new storage account, so on and so forth, right? And this is imperative nature. You are saying to Service Manager, hey, Service Manager, go create for me a VM. Now, with ARM, what we bring to the table is a declarative way of describing your applications. And so what you do is you describe the goal state of your application. This is done through JSON. You say, hey, here are the inputs I want to take. Here are the resources I want you to provision. ARM, go make it so. And ARM handles this orchestration of deployment across all the various services. Okay? So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about these deployments. These template deployments, or an entity that we call a deployment, it tracks template execution. Okay, so these are actually entities that you can create, manage, update through our API surface area. Deployments are always created within a single resource group. So one thing that's important to understand here is this means that a deployment does not span multiple resource groups. The other thing is because a deployment is in its own right a tracked entity, you can actually nest deployments. And this allows you to have very, very complex, very, very large scale applications that are modeled in a very flexible manner. And we'll actually look at an example of this here in a little bit. So now that I've bored you with, I think that was 7 slides, let's switch over and actually take a look at some code. So we're going to be looking at a number of different surfaces we have for interacting with Resource Manager today. We're going to use PowerShell, we're going to use the Azure CLI, and we'll also use the Azure portal. In almost all cases, what I'm going to show you is available through all 3 of those surfaces. However, if there are any caveats along the way, I'll let you know, okay? So we will start by, I know when I started coding, the first thing I wrote was Hello World. How many of you guys wrote Hello World first? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do Hello World together in a template. So I have a PowerShell script here in the ISE, and I'm going to run it. So the first thing it's going to do is log me in to Azure. These are credentials that are from Azure Active Directory that my company, Microsoft, has federated with AAD. I'm going to enter my password. And one thing that's really cool here is you'll notice that when Microsoft configured how AAD works with Azure, they set a policy that requires that I have 2-factor authentication. So that's enforced here as well. It's a pretty cool security mechanism. So I'll use my virtual smart card. And here in just a moment, there we go. My PowerShell script now has the JOT needed to authenticate and authorize all of my actions inside of Resource Manager. So next what's going to happen and this is an important gotcha when you're looking to use Resource Manager from PowerShell or CLI, you need to switch your Azure mode. So our PowerShell commandlets today support the old service management APIs as well as the resource management APIs, and you have to tell that particular PowerShell run space which set of commandlets to load and use. Once that's done, I have a few things that initialize demo magic, and then we create a resource group. So as you can see, we have new Azure resource group. I provide a name for my resource group, and then I provide a location for it. Now, this is where we store the metadata about that particular resource group. It does not restrict what locations you can deploy the resources that are contained within that resource group. Okay, so this might be important to you if you need to deal with data sovereignty. It allows you to deploy your resource group and keep that metadata within a particular geographical boundary. Okay, and then the final thing that we do is we kick off or create a deployment. I call that deployment Hello World Demo. I specify that that deployment is supposed to occur inside of the Hello World resource group, and then I provide it with a link to my template file. Now, these template files can come from a number of places. Number one is they can come from your local file system. Number two is I keep all of mine in GitHub, and so what I do is I use a link to the raw template JSON that's on GitHub itself. You can also specify parameters in a number of different ways. Parameters can be specified either via a parameters file, also once again locally or remotely hosted. They can be specified as inline parameters when you execute the commandlet, or they can be provided interactively, which we'll do here in a moment, okay? So what happened is that deployment executed. You can see here we have deployment name, correlation ID, bunch of other information. And then in the very last section, you'll see we have outputs, and I output hello world. So we just ran our first template together that tells us hello world. So with this in mind, let's take a look at what this template actually looks like. So looking at the template, the first thing that we do is we define what schema this template is written in. And so this uses our GA schema from 2015, January 1st actually. There's content version. Candidly, we don't really use this a lot right now. We really use it to match between parameter files and template files, but that's about it. So most people don't really use it much. They just leave it at 1.0.0.0. Parameters, in this example, we don't have any, but parameters specifies what information you want to gather from the user. This can be a string, an int, a secure string, or complex objects. Variables are, entities that you want to set statically or compute dynamically based on the parameters that are provided to you by the user. And then we have the resources section, which actually tells ARM what to go, or I'm sorry, Resource Manager, tells Resource Manager what to go and create. And then finally, we have an output section, which in this case, this is where we got our lovely hello world message from, okay? So how about we actually create something a little bit more useful? So now let's switch over to our Azure CLI, okay? And let's create a storage account. So what you're going to see is, and I have a little batch file that fires these commands off, is the first thing we do is we Azure login. I'm going to provide my credentials. We will then procure that JOT from AD. I'll take just a moment. And then we'll follow the exact same steps that we followed over in PowerShell. We will switch over into ARM mode. We will then create a resource group, and then we'll create a deployment into that resource group. And this template specifies or asks for a storage account name, so it knows what to name my storage account. And so what you'll notice here is the CLI prompts me to enter this information. So in this case, we will call this build demo Rye Jones. That should be unique. And hopefully nobody else has used that storage account name. And so what now is going to happen is we're going to provision that storage account. This will take a couple of seconds to happen. So while that happens, let's look at this template inside of Visual Studio. So what you'll notice is we have the schema, just like we did last time. We also have the content version, no change there. But then you'll see we start taking parameters. So the first parameter that we take is storage account name. It is of type string. The next thing we do is we gather storage account type. Now in this case, you'll notice I wasn't prompted for a storage account type. Well, the reason why is because there was a default specified here. Okay, and so when using interactive data entry, we pull defaults rather than prompt people for things for which they have set defaults. Same thing for location as well, okay? And so then when we go to the resources section, what you'll see is we define a resource. It is of type Microsoft.storage, WAC storage accounts. The name of this entity is actually the parameter that I entered. So we look at parameters, and then we pull the storage account name. We provision using a specific API version. We tell Resource Manager in what location we should provision the resource. And then we specify a set of properties about that storage account, which is our storage account type, which we pulled from the default values above. Okay? And then once this is done, instead of just saying it's completed or successful or whatever else, we wanted to provide richer data about this particular storage account. And so what we do is we use the reference function, which actually instructs the template to perform a get against the provisioned object. And so what we get is all the information, all the properties of that particular storage account. And so what you'll see here is our deployment succeeded, and we have a storage account called Ryan, or build demo Rye Jones. Okay? So, cool, we just deployed 2 templates together. So, we did that with Azure CLI as well. So I want to touch briefly on the template language expressions that we have for ARM templates. You can base 64 encode strings. You can concatenate strings. We also have the ability to copy resources. Sometimes people will call this resource loops, but we don't actually loop. We copy because looping is an imperative construct while copy is a declarative construct. We have the ability to list keys. These could be like storage account keys or other resources, which have keys, of course. String padding, retrieval of parameters, retrieval of information about the resource providers that you're calling, the ability to reference a given resource, the ability to find out the current resource group context in which the deployment is running, the ability to build a resource ID, the ability to get the subscription context in which the template is running, and then finally the ability to access your various variables defined in the template. And so if you're looking for examples on how to use these various template language expressions, we have a bunch of them up on GitHub, and actually my repo, so github.com, whack-rjmax, whack ARM examples. There's about 24 different examples of how you can use the template language expressions. Very simple examples, just so that we can express and explain how the language functions work, rather than focusing on the intricacies of the resources themselves. So with that in mind, let's talk about some more advanced template scenarios. So number one is we support what we call resource extensions. This is actually something that's very, very important about ARM and is a differentiator when we look at the various other declarative deployment and orchestration systems in the market. Many of these other systems, they focus either exclusively on the topology of the application, or they focus exclusively on the code that is operating inside of the various resources. Well, Resource Manager provides you with a way to do both of these things. And the way that it does this is through what we call resource extensions. Okay? So you not only provision a VM, but you can also say, hey, I would like that guest OS or that virtual machine to be configured using DSC, Chef, Puppet, custom script, or something else. Many, many options there. It also allows you to deploy an app service or a website and then deploy a web app into that website by using web deploy, or initializing SQLDB schema using Backpack, okay? We support copying of resources, we support nested template deployments, and we also have ways that you can implement new or existing patterns as well. So one of the common questions that we get asked is, well, how do I implement conditional logic, like if or else type logic inside of an ARM template? And the answer is you don't, because those are imperative constructs rather than declarative constructs. But however, we do have ways that you can provide information into the template such that it can either provision, for example, a new storage account or use an existing storage account, okay? And in fact, there's an example of new or existing for storage account out on that GitHub repository. We just don't have time to look at it today, all right? So let's look at a more advanced demo. This is actually a very, very large template. And I actually want to give special thanks to our friend Trent at Fullscale 180. He's one of our MVPs and has been doing a lot of work with us to help make sure that we build ARM and build the new compute network and storage resource providers well. And so he came up with this. It's a beast of a template. It's pretty awesome. So we're going to get to spend a bit of time in this template to look at how it works and what all is going on in there. So, oh, you know what? Hold on one second, guys. Okay, apologies about that. I forgot I had two different machines here. And so no matter how many times I click the link here, it's not going to open on my laptop. So this is actually where we have a lot of quick start templates on how to use the new compute networking and storage stack. And so I would encourage you to take a look at these various examples. It'll help you get up and running using ARM and the new compute stack really quickly. And so what this particular template does is it deploys an Elasticsearch cluster. And so what you'll see here is there's a lot of information about this particular template. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this Deploy to Azure button. And so what this is going to do is it's going to deep link into the portal, the Azure portal, and it's going to provide me with an experience through which I can provide all the parameters needed to deploy this Elasticsearch application, okay? So I will enter my smart card PIN. And so it's going to log into the portal. This will take a few moments. So while the portal loads, let's go over and take a look at the JSON that drives this particular template. And there's a couple things I want to highlight. One is you'll see many, many parameters in this template, far more parameters that we had for the storage account earlier. You'll also note that you're able to provide metadata about the parameters, and this can be used by tools like our portal, for example, to provide tooltips or help or information about a particular template. The other thing I wanted to make sure that we looked at was deployment. Let's try this. So I wanted to look at how deployments and copy are being used inside of this template. So in this case, how many of you are familiar with Elasticsearch? A couple of you? Okay. So in this particular template, we have data nodes, and it's one of the tiers that can be dynamically scaled. And so what Trent did here was, instead of going through and defining each data node multiple times, what he's done is he's actually copied the set of data nodes. And he is also, rather than copying the VMs directly, he is copying a template, copying a template deployment, so that he's able to provision not only that VM by itself in a copy set, but also all of the resources associated with that VM in the copy set. And so what you'll see here is he's creating a deployment, right? Microsoft.resources, WAC deployments, with a name that is built dynamically. And he specifies here how many copies of this particular deployment he wants, which is driven by one of the parameters he gathers from the end user. Okay? And so if we look at one of the nested templates that he's executing as a part of these copied deployments, let's see, I'm going to go in and we will look for extension. And so what you'll notice is we were talking about resource extensions earlier. He's not only provisioning the VM, but he is using, for Linux, the custom script extension to dynamically configure Elasticsearch inside of each of these virtual machines as defined in his master template. Okay? So with this in mind, let's look at what the end user experience looks like for this particular template. So you'll see here, it's populated the portal UX with the JSON for that template. It is now going to turn around and build a UX for me entering the parameters. And so I'm going to very quickly enter all of these parameters. There are a number of them because this is a very complex template. Deploy to West US. Specify which OS to use. In this case, we're using Ubuntu. Create an internal load balancer. I will not provision a jump box because we actually aren't going to run any Elasticsearch queries. I'll define a number of client nodes. I will provide a size for the data nodes. I will provide the number of scale units, the size for the data disk, the cluster name, and the version of Elasticsearch. I'm going to click OK. I'm going to deploy this into the build demo resource group that we created a few minutes ago, and I'm going to click Create. And so now what's going to happen is it's going to kick off execution of the top-level master template as well as all of the nested templates as well. This will take several minutes to execute, so we'll flip back to our presentation while this runs. So I now want to change gears. We've talked about deployment for the last 25 minutes or so, and I want to talk a little bit about how Resource Manager helps you organize your resources. One of the big things that we see changing is, in the past, people were kind of kicking the tires on the cloud, creating a resource or two. So if they were viewing all the resources, it was a short list. It was, maybe a couple dozen things at most. In most cases, it was actually fewer than a dozen. Well, now we see people deploying much larger and much more complex applications to the cloud, and therefore they need a better way to group these things. And there's a bunch of ways that you can do this with resource groups, and so we'll dig into that here in a minute. The other thing is, in some cases, it makes sense for you to have resources in one resource group, but where resources in another resource group depend on them. And so it's important that we have a way for you to be able to track that metadata, and we allow you to do this through what we call linked resources. And then finally, we wanted to provide a more loosely structured manner for you to categorize and organize your resources, and we do that through what we call tags. So let's talk a little bit about resource group organization. So this is probably the most common pattern that we see people following, okay? I have one resource group that is used for one application, and I deploy one template into that resource group. Of course, that template can contain multiple resources, and you can articulate dependencies either implicitly or explicitly between the different resources contained in that template. We recommend implicit references, so implicit references via the reference function. However, you can also have explicit dependencies expressed via the depends on function in the language as well, okay? So the other way that we see people do this is application-focused resource groups, where a resource group contains all of the resources associated with a given app. However, they create tier-centric templates. And so in this case, what you'll see is rather than having one template like we had in the last example, we have three templates, where we have a template for database, a template for web, and a template for the VM tier, okay? Now, there's a variation on this theme where we wrap each of those three templates into a parent template, and we do nested deployments, like we did a moment ago in our example, okay? And this is where we actually foresee most complex applications, or most applications that can be deployed in a multitude of different ways. We view this as kind of the way that they will be modeled, okay? And then finally, the last way that we see this kind of shaping out is tier-centric resource groups and templates, okay? Where you have a resource group for each app tier, right? So here we have a database tier and resource group. We have a web tier template, and resource group, and we have a VM tier, template, and resource group. And this is where we use the link resource to define the relationship that exists between the SQL database and like the app service that hosts the website, okay? So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about resource tags. Tags are name value pairs that are associated with either resource groups or resources. And this provides you with a subscription-wide way of providing metadata about these different resources. And each resource can have up to 15 tags. So I have to admit, when I found out people were kind of cooking up this feature, I didn't totally get it. But when I thought about the scenarios and the way that tags could be used, I found it to be much, much more compelling. And so the first example of this is you can tag your resources or your resource groups by environment to say, hey, this resource group or this particular resource is for dev or for test or for prod, okay? And what this allows you to do is then turn around after the fact and query for all your prod resources. Yeah, useful, right? The other thing you can do is you can tag by role. So let's say you have thousands of VMs. Those VMs probably serve different functions or purposes. Some of them act as web services, web servers. Some of them act as middle tier. Some of them act as database servers. You can tag by role, okay? The other thing is tagging by department. So when we think about larger enterprises where you have resources that are in use by HR or resources that are in use by finance or by legal or something like that, you can tag by department. And then finally, my most favorite is tag by responsible party. So when something breaks, they know who to call. And I just make sure there's never a tag with my name on it. So a couple tagging tips there for you. So let's show a brief demo of tagging, and we'll do this from the Azure CLI. I hope it's all right that we're switching back and forth between the different environments for this. So I'm going to fire off this quick batch file. And so what I'm doing here is that build demo resource group that we created earlier, I'm tagging it to say this is a production environment. I mean, I guess it kind of is production since I think we're being recorded right now. So, and then what I do is I then turn around and query and find out which resources or resource groups have been tagged with that environment production key value pair. And so you'll see that comes back as a part of our second command, right? So very, very useful, very handy feature. So let's now move into our third big area of investment, or our third pillar for Resource Manager. And this is control. As we see people deploying more and more resources to the cloud, as we see people deploying applications that are more of a mission-critical nature, we find that it's increasingly important to allow people to control who can manage, work with, touch these resources. And so with Resource Manager, we provide 3 ways that we do this. Number 1 is with role-based access control. This was the number 1 ask from you guys for many, many years in Azure, and so we finally have it. The next is audit logging. So because Resource Manager is the central API for interacting with all of the resources from the management plane, we're able to audit all of those management operations and log them in a central place for you. And then finally, we have what we call resource locks, which I'm going to talk more about here in a moment. So let's click into role-based access control. So this allows you to secure access to resources or resource groups or subscriptions with very granular permissions. It's assignable to users or groups or service principals, so pretty much anything that I can think of that you'd need to assign permissions to. If you have an idea that's not here, please let us know. We'd love to know about it. And we provide a set of built-in roles that makes it very easy for you to get started, because one of the things that's challenging as you start going from a wide open or co-admin focused experience like what we've had historically to something with greater degrees of control is it can be very difficult to author what these roles looks like, okay? And so we provide, I think it's almost 3 dozen roles out of the box now. So with role-based access control, there are 2 main concepts that we need to make sure that we understand. The first is what we call role definitions. A role definition describes the set of permissions that this role is giving the given entity, okay? And so this could be read-only. This could be read-write. This could be read-write with full control to manage RBAC. And these role definitions can be used across many, many assignments. Okay? So let's talk about what a role assignment is. A role assignment associates three things. It associates a role definition with an identity, user group, and a scope. Okay? And these role assignments are always inherited. And so what this means is if you grant someone permissions at contributor or owner scope at the subscription level, they will also have that level of permission on the resource groups that are nested inside of that subscription and the resources that are in those resource groups that are inside of that subscription. Okay? And so to illustrate that, we have this lovely graphic that shows, hey, I can give people contributor, owner, or reader permission at the subscription level that flows down to the resource group level, where I also have contributor, owner, or reader roles, and then down to the resource level as well, okay? And so what this means is I can grant people access to everything. I can grant people access to what is essentially an application, or I can grant access to a particular resource in a particular application. And so the way that we do this is actually through our URI structure. So ARM follows a very canonical pattern where we always subscriptions, whack your subscription ID, resource groups, whack your resource group name, whack providers, whack the provider namespace, whack the type of the resource that you're wanting to manipulate or interact with, whack the instance name of that particular resource. And so we allow you to, as I said earlier, provide access at the subscription level. So you can just imagine that being subscription, whack your subscription ID, whack wildcard, or resource group, where we go to continue down the line to resource groups, whack resource group name, whack wildcard, or all the way down to the resource level as well, okay? So with this in mind, let's do a quick demo. So we'll go back to my laptop here, and we will go to my RBAC script. So the first thing that I'm going to do in this script is I'm going to get the object ID of I guess my partner in crime, our dev manager, because I'm sure I did something wrong in that template that we deployed a few minutes ago, and I need him to go in and take a look at it, okay? So I'm going to get the object ID of his user in Azure Active Directory. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the resource group path associated with that build demo resource group that we created earlier. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign him contributor permissions to that resource group. And so he will be able to do anything he wants to on that resource group itself or the resources that exist inside of that resource group. He will not be able to grant other people permissions because he is just of the contributor role rather than of the owner role. And so I'm going to run this right now. And so in a few moments, I will have given Charles permission to manage that, that particular resource group. Okay, so Charles goes in and performs all of his magic. Everything now works. Everyone is now happy. And so now I can turn around and remove that role assignment. It'll prompt me to confirm. And I'll now remove that role assignment so that he's no longer able to access this resource. This is super, super powerful when we think about how people can begin to start collaborating with one another in the cloud, as well as how we can begin to provide a more enterprise-grade experience for consuming and using resources in Azure. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is our audit logging capability. So for all write, delete, update, actions performed against resources, we write these to a centralized location and using a common format. And so what that allows you to do is very quickly and easily view at the resource group level, for example, all the actions that have been performed on that resource group or the resources in it. And so to show you how this works, we will demo quickly. So I will go to logs, And so what you'll see here is I get Azure Resource Group log for the build demo resource group, and then I specify a start time. And so I say, hey, we've only been here about an hour, so tell me what happened in the last hour up to right now. Okay? And so what I'll do is I'll run this script. And so what you'll see is who performed what actions on which entities. So this is very, very rich. This is more or less a dump of the information that we use to authorize all the actions in Resource Manager. So super, super powerful for you to be able to see who has done what over a long period of time. And of course, because it's all accessible via Azure CLI or PowerShell, you can also pull this information into other systems for analysis on your own, as you see fit. Okay? So flipping back over to our PowerPoint deck. The final thing I wanted to talk about was resource locks. And this is another one of those features. When I first heard about it, I scratched my head. But then when I began to understand the utility of the feature, I really kind of fell in love with it. It's kind of one of my favorite features that we have. And at the end of the day, accidents happen, and resource locks helps prevent them. And what they allow you to do is it allows administrators to create policies which prevent write actions or prevent accidental deletion of resources or resource groups. So how many of you have ever deleted something that was production accidentally? I know I have. It was really embarrassing. Like we have these, we call them LSI reviews, where we have to go in front of the execs and explain how we messed up. That was a rough one. It was really embarrassing. So anyway, with that in mind, there are 3 key concepts here that we want to make sure everyone understands. Number 1 is the resource lock, which is a policy that enforces a lock level at a particular scope. The lock level is the type of enforcement, okay? Current values include, number 1, cannot delete. So you can't delete the production data. And the other is read-only. So you can't create or update. I call this the don't push updates, like at 5 o'clock on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. Like, it's kind of goofy, but it actually has very, very real and helpful applications. And then finally, the scope is the realm to which this lock level is applied. And it's expressed as a URI. So you can set it at either the resource group or the resource scope. And so let's show what this looks like. So I will go to resource locks. And so we're going to start by locking the storage account that we created at the beginning of today's session. And so we provide a lock name, the resource that we are locking, the type of that resource, some notes about it, and then the resource group in which the resource lives that we are locking. So I'll run that. It'll ask me, hey, are you sure you want to do this? And so now someone can neither update or delete. Cannot update or delete that lock. And you'll see that we provide information to confirm that the lock has been created. So the other thing is that whole resource group that I've been working on, this whole demo, I also now want to allow people to update it but not delete anything in it, because I don't want them to ruin the rest of my demos. And so I'll run that, it'll confirm. And so now what I've done is I've placed the resource group in a mode where it can be updated, it can be read, but it cannot be deleted, okay? And so, of course, I can now turn around and enumerate all of the resource locks that currently exist. And you'll see there are 2 of them, one of them at resource group scope, the other at resource scope. And then, of course, to wrap things up, I can remove the resource locks as well. I will confirm. And so now those resources are free to be deleted, okay? One note about these particular commandlets. They landed very hot for this event, and so you can try this next week. I have the special magic build of the commandlets that lets me show you the feature a bit early, okay? And it's still a work in progress for Azure CLI as well, okay? So with that in mind, You guys have been very patient listening to me talk for the last 45 minutes. So what's your call to action? What would I ask you to do after this session? Number one is I tell you, deploy a template today. There are lots of examples available in the official Azure GitHub repository of quick start templates that will help you deploy things like I showed you with Elasticsearch earlier today, along with a bunch of other templates. I mean, there's like many, many dozens of them. The second thing is if you want to become more comfortable with the template language by using simpler, more elemental template examples, I have some examples there in my personal repo. Word of warning, like it is my personal working repo, so it might not work the day that you try it. It just is what it is, I guess. And then finally, we have lots and lots of documentation available on azure.com at that link there. So, in fact, in the deck, which will be available to you guys probably now or in the very near future, we have all sorts of documentation on how to do everything from using PowerShell with RM, how to use Azure CLI with RM, how to handle RBAC, how to tag. Really tried to provide you guys with everything you need to start building the next level of cloud applications. So, with that in mind, I want to stop talking and I want to take questions, comments, feedback from you guys. So I would ask if you have a question, please use the microphone. If you can't, yell loudly and I will repeat it to the audience, even though it's kind of hard to see you because of the stage lights. So, yes, sir.
So for the templates, is it possible to have like a logic on the UI? If somebody selects, let's say, option A from a drop-down, then you hide some of the fields, something like that, is it possible?
So the UX that you saw today is statically generated from the parameters that are in the template, okay? The gallery experiences that you see in our gallery actually have special code, and what happens behind the scenes is they leverage our newer existing pattern to switch the execution of the template itself. But which parameters are shown or hidden by the UI is a UI-only construct. It's not reflected in the template language. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not possible.
Correct. It's possible. It's just not shown in the UX. Yes, sir.
So are web and worker roles supported right now?
Which?
Web and worker roles. So can I also deploy cloud services with it?
Yes, so cloud services, I know the answer to that question. I don't know if I can answer it in the room. Can I say, I can't see what he's doing? Say yes. Yes, I can say yes. Okay, they are supported. In fact, you can see this through a new portal now. We are not documenting the full set of the APIs because we actually don't want people running out and building lots and lots of new apps on web and worker role. We have other technologies that, like IaaS v2 that we want, and Service Fabric that we want people to begin using.
Okay.
You ask me and I'll put you in touch with someone.
Hi
Yes,
there.
sir.
Just wondering if you've got anything that helps debugging building these complicated
That is an
templates.
excellent question. So there are two primary mechanisms that we have to assist with authoring and debugging. The first one is, and it's still a work in progress, we have schema validation available to you inside of Visual Studio to help you understand whether or not you're building a template appropriately. Now, I can tell you this template executes, however, you'll notice there are squiggly lines. So the schemas are still catching up with the abilities of the various services in production, okay? But it generally helps you get close. The other thing is, and we'll see whether or not our demo, so it happened our demo failed. Maybe this is a good thing. And so what you'll see is here, I can actually go in and view the information about what happened that caused this particular failure. And so what we'll see is, I think I have an orphaned disk out there that is preventing this VM tier from continuing to provision, okay? So, what's that? So yes, I can delete the resource group. Yeah, I can delete it and reprovision, or I can just run the same template over the same resource group. Yes, sir. Any other questions?
Yesterday, Mark talked about some billing options that you can, with the tags and stuff, you can see some extra billing information on. Is that's not released yet, I assume, but he said it was coming.
Looking back to the UX guy. Do we have tag-based pivot for billing data? Okay, I can tell you that if you pull the billing CSV, that data is in there, but I don't think we render it yet in the portal.
Okay, then my next question is, right now when you're on an EA agreement, you can make sub-subscriptions.
Mm-hmm.
Is there some guidance of when to do that and when to use tagging and resource groups?
That's a great question. So when we look at subscriptions, we think of these in terms of one, the function of the the function of that subscription, and then also who's paying the bill at the end of the day. And so like resource groups we think is primarily being an application or resource organizational construct, while we think of the subscription boundary as really a billing ownership boundary. Does that make sense, and did I answer your question? Okay, great. Any other questions out there? Sorry, I feel weird peering out, but otherwise I can't see you guys. It's bright up here. Okay, well, thank you everyone for your time. Oh, yes, sir.
For debugging purposes, you also look at the Azure Resource Explorer. There's also a nice website.
Yes. Yes, that's actually resources.azure.com. It would help if I could spell it correctly. Resources. There we go. And I've been there before, as you can tell. Okay, cool. So it's up. So one of the cool things is actually, since we use standard authentication protocols for ARM, we've kind of had a bunch of people that have gone out and built tools for interacting with it. This was actually built by some folks in our web platform team. And what it allows you to do is essentially browse and go through and view all of the resources that exist in your various subscriptions. And so you can see the availability sets, the VMs, the load balancers, so on and so forth. And so you can also see, of course, the raw data that's going to and from these various API endpoints. So thank you for bringing that up. It's funny, actually, the button that I clicked that launched the portal, that button was built by the same guys that built this. So we're seeing all sorts of cool things around how people can build apps that leverage ARM, not just as their deployment orchestration engine, but also they're building on top of ARM really as more like an API platform. So it's kind of cool and exciting to use. And some of those documents that I linked to earlier talk about how, if you want to build a custom application that communicates with ARM, how you handle custom application authentication. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
So you mentioned that we could do a lot with websites, the database. You mentioned that we could actually do a deploy script that could set the website, set the database, and then connect that SQL connection back to the website. So that's all doable.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, in fact, if you go through Portal today and create a website with a SQL, it actually uses a resource manager template behind the scenes to do that. And one of the things is in that flow, you may have noticed, it gives you the option of using an existing SQL database or creating a new one. They're actually in the process of transitioning to the newer existing pattern that I was talking about earlier. That's the alternative to either dynamic template composition or conditional logic in the templating language.
Okay. And then also, if I already have something set up, can I generate a template from what's already set up in Azure?
That's a very common feature ask. It's something we're thinking about a lot. It's also a very hard problem to solve, and we haven't solved it yet. But feedback heard. It's an awesome idea. I'd love to build it. Oh, you're welcome. Kind of. Yeah. Yes, it does. It does. Because in many cases, the properties that you get back from Resource Explorer are the same properties that you would set in your template. But you're right on. Yes, sir. Excellent question. So there are a couple of ways that people monitor resources in Azure today. Some people use New Relic, some people use Insights, some people use Application Insights. Those things can actually be modeled as resources as well. I'm trying to think if I have an example of how to do that. Yes, I do. Give me one moment. Is it okay if we do this dynamically together? Okay, no promises it'll work. So I'll go to New Project, create a new resource group. Okay, I will select from this set of templates. We'll do, actually, since this gentleman asked earlier, website plus SQL. Okay, and so it's now going to load in and create a project from that particular template. I'm going to open up the JSON for that, and then I'm going to find Insights. And so what you'll see here is, as a part of this template, we actually create auto-scale settings. We create alert rules based on server errors, forbidden request, high CPU, yes. And so you can express that through the templating language as well. So did I answer your question? Excellent. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Yes. There is a reason for that. Oh, yes, thank you. The question is, there used to be a SharePoint farm template, but if you tried to download that, you'd get an empty file. The question was, why? The answer is complicated. Pretty much, we were dynamically composing the template because we didn't have some of the nested and copy functionality that we have in Resource Manager now. And so there actually wasn't a single template that you could download. The other thing was that was provisioning against the classic compute stack, not the new compute stack that we announced yesterday. And so we didn't want people authoring templates against that former stack. So two reasons. I would expect to see a real SharePoint template that you can download over the coming months as we refactor. Yes? Did I answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I'll hang around here for a while if you have additional questions, all right? Thanks again.